You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. Each bi-monthly episode will be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. Today's episode is brought to you by Ritchie. Classic Equine by Ritchie automatic waterers stand out in their field, not yours, with aesthetically pleasing designs that provide clean drinking water for your horses without the work or worry. Ritchie keeps the water flowing, letting you spend more quality time with your horse, delivering a standout performance, all while blending in. Learn more at ritchiefount.com. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and today my guest is Dr. Krishona Martinson, professor and equine extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Martinson.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we're going to be talking about the exciting and very important topic of pasture maintenance. So can you tell us a little bit about why it's important for barn managers and farm owners to manage their horse pastures well?
Sure. Well, this is certainly a big, giant topic, right? And I think a topic that's sort of mysterious to a lot of horse owners. And fortunately, it's kind of my passion area and my research area. So why horse owners and barn managers need to manage their pastures? There's a couple different things. First, it's an economic decision. Pastures are generally 1/3 the cost of hay. So we know that horses need to ingest forage of some type, whether that's in fresh pasture during the growing season or during hay during the winter months or when you don't have access to pasture. And normally, there are costs associated with pastures, but it is usually 1/3 the cost of hay. So right off the bat, there's a huge economic incentive to manage pastures.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I've never heard that figure before, but wow, that really puts it in perspective.
Yes. So the longer and the more pasture you can, access with your horses, better off financially. We know that, aside from horse health or veterinary bills, feeding your horse is one of the number one costs of horse ownership. And along with the cost, we also know there's just a general overall health benefit to horses on pasture. There is a lot of research looking at bone development of young horses and sort of that the benefits of turnout and exercise. And so having a well-managed pasture allows horses to be turned out. They're grazing what is essentially a very complete diet for the vast majority of adult healthy horses. And they're getting that benefit of exercise and fresh air and potentially being with their herd mates. So there's that socialization aspect. So overall, we just know that there's a general health benefit to horses being on pasture as well.
I think you're bringing a lot of our other episodes full circle, because something that I hear from many experts is the importance of fresh air or ventilation and grazing. We also talked about hindgut health on our other podcast, Ask the Horse Live. And I think the number one answer to all of the hindgut health questions were turn your horse out, let them put their heads down and graze.
Or anything that, horses evolved as, trickle feeders. So the best way to trickle feed a horse is to allow them pasture. Or we've also done a lot of research, and again, this is a different topic, but using grazing muzzles to slow them down, or using a hay net if you're feeding hay, anything to slow them down and allow them to have those small meals throughout the day. And of course, pasture is the easiest, or one of the easiest ways to accomplish that.
Yeah, for sure. So you've touched on it a little bit, but are there any other downfalls of having a poor quality pasture?
Oh, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I think people or horse owners think any pasture is good. And there are a lot of potential downfalls with poorly managed pasture. First of all, and it's hard for horse owners to grasp, because I think every horse owner envisions driving, pulling into their driveway after a long, hard day of work to support our equine friends and athletes. And you want to see your horses frolicking in this beautiful pasture. And that's just not a picture that a lot of us are able to see. And some of the biggest downfalls is, first, not all horses can graze. If you have a horse with metabolic syndrome, obesity, current bouts of laminitis, or a history of laminitis, we know that those horses have sensitivities to non-structural carbohydrates. And remember, pastures were designed to grow meat and milk. They were really designed for cattle, whether we want them to be milking or reproducing or raising calves. And it kind of evolved into also being there for horses. And if you have a horse that is unhealthy, overweight, or has a sensitivity to carbohydrates, pastures are just not an ideal food or forage for those types of horses. So first of all, it's that hard realization that not every horse can graze.
Yeah, I have 2 miniature horses who definitely cannot be out on pasture. And
Yes.
I get some questions from friends or maybe family members who don't know as much about horses about why they're in the paddock with no grass versus the other one that's got lush grass all the time. And it's just simply it's not healthy for them.
I know you should respond. I'm saving their lives. I'm
Yeah.
prolonging our time together. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the other thing is, a lot of people are horse owners. They're animal people. They probably grew up or they've done a lot of research on how to care for horses. They listen to podcasts like this, right? They educate themselves. But most horse owners are not agronomists. And I happen to come up through the agronomy field. So agronomy is a study of field crops that includes forages. And at first glance, you may think, how did an agronomist become a horse specialist? But when you think that the vast majority of a horse's diet is forages, it makes perfect sense. So we know that overgrazed pastures usually are infested with weeds, and some of those weeds are unfortunately toxic. And horses are really sensitive to a lot of toxic plants, unlike some dairy cattle and some small ruminants like goats and sheep. So we do have to be really concerned about weeds in pasture. And the other thing that people fail to realize, if you do have a horse with carbohydrate sensitivities, the lowest 2 inches of a pasture, which are grasses that are found in overgrazed pastures, we know that they are highest in non-structural carbohydrates. So a lot of people will think, well, I'm going to turn out my laminitic pony onto this overgrazed pasture because there is nothing for them to eat. But what they do have access to is actually the highest in non-structural carbohydrates. And inadvertently, we're causing a bigger problem just because horse owners don't know a lot about forages. And it's hard. I mean, I've spent my entire career learning about forages and understanding this better. So we try really hard to share that with horse owners and to try to correct some of those misconceptions.
That's interesting. I've actually never heard that before, but that's really good to know considering I have 2 ponies with metabolic problems.
Yes.
So you mentioned weeds a little bit, and I think that's something that I often see in the overgrazed pastures is the weeds really start coming up then. So how can you manage weed growth and also the toxic plants? How do you watch out for those?
So the very first thing is you simply have to avoid overgrazing. So from a plant's perspective, grazing is a stressful environment or a stressful event, right? You have these large horses with small hooves. So you have a lot of hoof traffic and stomping. And also horses can graze with incredible force. I'm sure if anyone's been on a trail ride or watched their horses graze, they can sometimes pull up the entire plant, root and all. And you're like, stop that, put that back, right? So horses graze with a lot of force. So the biggest thing is for most of our cool season grasses, and our cool season grasses are really dominant over about 2/3, of our pastures. And I'm located far north, right? In Minnesota, cool season grasses is what we have because we have winter. That doesn't allow our warm season grasses to thrive. So cool season grasses are like Kentucky bluegrass orchard grass, brome grass, and fescues. Where warm season grasses are more like your Bahia grass or your Bermuda grass that you see in the southern 1/3 of the US. And then there's, of course, a transition zone where you can get a little bit of both. And of course, there's some legumes like clovers and alfalfa, but really those cool season grasses are our predominant grasses. The good thing is, if you manage them correctly, they can really, really outcompete a lot of weeds. So we never want our pastures grazed below 3 inches, which to a lot of people is like, are you kidding me? No, we are not. Because remember, the bottom 2 inches is incredibly high in non-structural carbohydrates, but that's also the growing point of these grasses. So by allowing them to have, 3 inches, there's always some leaf material that's collecting sunlight and photosynthesis and helping those plants regrow. That way they don't have to rely on their roots. When a plant is consistently grazed, there isn't enough leaf material to capture sunlight. So they have to rely on their stored carbohydrates in their roots. And eventually those become depleted. And that's why we see open spots and overgrazed fields. And of course, what grows in the open spots? Weeds, because those seeds are in the soil seed bank and they last a really long time. So, just practicing rotational grazing, which I think we'll get to, and avoiding overgrazing is the biggest thing we can do, because our grasses and our pasture forages are quite resilient if we just help them along a little bit.
Sure. And you touched on it a little bit with the cool season grasses, but is there anything else that farm managers should know about the role that climate plays in the quality of horse pasture?
Climate is everything. And so, currently in Minnesota, the past several years in the upper Midwest, we've had severe droughts. Now, this year, we are the opposite. We have massive flooding and, we've had too much moisture. We just can't quite seem to get that happy medium. So your local climate and your soil type are key. So based on your local climate and your soil type, that really dictates your how many horses your pasture can support. So for in the upper Midwest, a guideline we use, and again, it's highly specific. If you do not want to supplement hay during the growing season, and in the upper Midwest, we say our growing season is maybe mid-May through mid-October. And the southern part of the US, it looks completely different. But we really want 2 acres of well-managed pasture per 1,000-pound horse. Now, if you go out west, to the mountainous region of the US, you may be looking at 20 to 40 acres per horse because you have a much drier climate, much sandier soils, and you maybe can't support these fast-growing cool season grasses. So it is so highly dependent on your location, your soil type, and then how much rain you are getting, if you have access to irrigation. But we are really at the mercy of Mother Nature.
Yeah, we are having some very dry and unseasonably warm weather here in Pennsylvania. And I'm noticing the toll that it's taking on my pasture. I also have a thoroughbred who does need pasture. And poor guy we're struggling to keep his pasture alive for him.
Yes, yes. And the only thing you can do when you're at the mercy of Mother Nature is when, on average, because horses also don't graze uniformly, they are sort of picky, as we all have seen with any kind of feed we kind of tend to give them. They're not going to graze the pasture uniformly, but on average, when they graze these cool season grasses down to about 3 inches, and we have to look at the majority of the pasture, we have to pull them off. And if we're in a current environment like Minnesota is, where we are getting just inundated with rainfall, those grasses may grow back up to that 6 to 8 inches where we are able to start regrazing again that area. It can be as soon as 2 weeks, where if you're in a drought condition, it could be 60 days. So we can never go off the calendar. We really have to look at plant height and plant development versus a calendar.
Sure. And so for people who might not be as experienced in looking at their pasture and considering the climate and the weather. Is there someone, like, who would these people reach out to for help in deciding what to do with their horse pastures?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of great resources. So most states have a land grant university, and most of those universities have an equine specialist like myself. Um, and because pasture and hay is such an important part of the horse's diet, each state or most states have a really good section on their website about pastures. So if you wanted to take the easiest, lowest hanging fruit, you could simply Google. And where you are, Hailey, you have some great you have a great equine extension specialist in Dr. Danielle Smarsh. But again, I could name off several of my colleagues across the U.S. Who have resources for horse pasture management. So I would first start with your land grant university. That's usually your state or public university in your state. If you aren't fortunate to have one, you could look at your county extension office. They will have county extension educators. Sometimes they have expertise with pastures and livestock, and sometimes they don't. It depends on who's in that position. You could reach out to your local soil and water conservation district or your local ag cooperative. They tend to have agronomists and grazing specialists, as long as your NRCS office. Again, those are just local, federal programs to help, individuals with grazing livestock.
Thank you. I think it's so important for us to know where we can get this information from and who can help us. I think horse people in general tend to be a little hyper independent, even when it's best to ask for some help. So it's always nice to know where you can get the help from.
Definitely.
Today's episode is brought to you by Ritchie. Classic Equine by Ritchie automatic waterers stand out in their field, not yours, with aesthetically pleasing designs that provide clean drinking water for your horses without the work or worry. Ritchie keeps the water flowing, letting you spend more quality time with your horse, delivering a standout performance, all while blending in. Learn more at ritchiefount.com. So we've touched on rotational grazing a little bit, and this is always a very popular topic that we get a lot of questions about. Can you talk about how horse farm owners can utilize rotational grazing to improve the quality of their pastures?
Oh, absolutely. So I think a lot of horse owners become overwhelmed when they think about rotational grazing and pasture management. But there's really only 5 things you need to know. The first one is you need to know when to mow your pasture. So mowing is one. And again, we know that horses do not graze uniformly. So let's say you have a rotational grazing system set up. Maybe you have a dry lot where you keep the horses over the winter months or during droughts, or when there's excessive rainfall, or when your pasture is regrowing. So you have a dry lot and then maybe 2 pastures. Let's say the horses graze in pasture 1, and on average, they're grazing it down to 3 inches. We can then move them to pasture 2 or into the dry lot. But by doing this, when we move the horses, that allows us time to work in that one pasture they were just grazing in. And one thing we do want to do is we would like to mow after each rotation, which I have horses. My daughters and I show horses locally. I also have a full-time job, and I try to have a life outside of horses, but honestly, it's a life outside of it, right?
Yeah.
So I understand that there are time constraints. Even if you can mow your pasture a couple times a year, what you want to do is set your mower height, whether it's a brush hog or a riding lawn mower or a lawnmower you're pulling behind a 4-wheeler. Just try to set it at that 3 to 4 inches. And by going out there and mowing the whole area, in certain areas, you won't mow anything, right? Because the horses have grazed it lower. And in other areas, you're going to mow quite a bit. But what that does is when we allow that pasture to regrow, it kind of keeps everything uniform. Because if you don't mow, what happens? The horses are always going to go back to that area that they've overgrazed. And as that other area, for whatever reason, whether it's because that's where they've defecated, or maybe there's just a few plant species they don't like as much, as that continues to grow and mature, we know as things get more mature, they tend to be less palatable, or the horse is less excited to graze them. So that is why horses continuously regraze in certain areas. But by mowing, we sort of level the playing field. So mowing is critical. So I'm giving you all permission to go out and buy the fanciest mower and or tractor and or four-wheeler that you need, right? I think every horse farm, if you're going to make a key investment for pastures, it's having a good mower or just a good way to mow your pasture.
Yeah, very true. If it takes super long or you have an inefficient mower, it just makes it even more miserable to go out and do it.
Yes, but I mean, sometimes you get a good tan. I guess that, but
That's
wear
true.
sunscreen, right? Like, be responsible.
Very true.
So the first thing you need to do is mow. The second thing is easy. Well, it's easier said than done. The second thing is letting that pasture rest. Once you mow it down to 3 inches, you have to let those cool, and I'm talking just cool season grasses. Because we're in Minnesota, my research program really focuses on cool season grasses. With the exception of teff, which is a warm season annual, we just can't grow warm season grasses up here in Minnesota. Our growing season is too short, and of course we have winter. So we mow and then we just let the pasture rest. And you have to let it go from 3 inches back up to 6 inches before you start grazing that area again. And this is why, rotational grazing is great, because while that pasture is regrowing, hopefully they're grazing in another pasture or they're on a dry lot, eating hay. So whatever it needs to happen, that's what we do. But the second thing is just letting that pasture rest. And I know the horses will look at you, they look over the gate longingly. They want out in that pasture. But we have to let that grass regrow, because as that grass is regrowing, it's capturing, the leaves are capturing sunlight. It's storing carbohydrates in their roots, and they're keeping a really strong root base. Where again, if we're constantly grazing an area, we are depleting all of those root reserves, and eventually that pasture will die out. So again, the second thing is resting, which we don't have to do anything. We just have to have that self-control to not open the gate.
That can be challenging.
Very much so. Yes. The third thing is dragging. And dragging, we simply want to disperse manure piles. And dragging has been sort of an interesting evolution in research. We used to want to drag or recommend dragging sort of every time we mowed. But now we know to help, kill off parasites that are in the manure, we only want to drag a couple times a year when it's hot and dry. Because as we disperse out those manure piles, the sunlight is actually what helps us kill those parasites. And if we do it during a time when it's cooler and wetter, we don't have as much killing of those parasite eggs as we do when it's hot and drier. So it sounds like, Hailey, right now, in Pennsylvania, it's hot and dry. It would be a great time to drag your pasture. If you're going to use an arena drag, just turn it so that the tines are up. We don't want to damage the growing points of those grass. A pallet, a section of chain link fence. It doesn't need to be a fancy drag, just something to disperse out those manure piles, but only during hot and dry times. And that is some really great research that has really been centralized and brought out of the University of Kentucky.
Awesome. I like the ideas for DIY drags. That makes it so much more accessible.
And again, it can be whatever. It doesn't need to be a fancy store-bought drag, just something to disperse the manure piles. Because I think we've all seen horses will not graze, very close to where they've defecated. So the other thing we need to do is fertilize and then control weeds, which gets back to one of your earlier questions about weed control. So fertilizing is something that is highly dependent on your area. You definitely need to reach out to your university or your county extension office. Each state has different recommendations. So for example, in Minnesota, I think a broad recommendation for all horse owners is to take a soil test once every 3 years and then fertilize accordingly. So a soil test will dictate how much fertilizer you apply to help with phosphorus and potassium. Minnesota, we're on the old prairie soils, so we rarely need a lot of phosphorus and potassium, and we want to be careful not to over-fertilize, because that is where we get runoff that can contaminate lakes and streams. So a soil sample will tell you how much fertilizer you need. Now, each region will have different recommendations for nitrogen. Nitrogen is highly mobile in the soil. So, for example, in Minnesota, for our cool season grass pastures, we recommend 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So that is an annual fertilizer need for nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium are based on the soil test, as would any other micronutrients like sulfur or anything else in your area. It is best to apply that fertilizer as early as you can in the spring, as soon as the soil is dry and things are just starting to grow. Because remember, those plants need that fertilizer. You can't have the horses remove and constantly graze off the grasses without helping those grasses grow. And the fertilizer is necessary. And we can't rely on manure because manure needs to go through a couple different kind of transformations before it can all be taken up by the plant. So manure helps, but we do have to apply fertilizer every year. For sure, nitrogen. And again, the exact amount will depend on where you live. And then your soil test will dictate what else you need.
Today's episode is brought to you by Ritchie. Classic Equine by Ritchie automatic waterers stand out in their field, not yours, with aesthetically pleasing designs that provide clean drinking water for your horses without the work or worry. Ritchie keeps the water flowing, letting you spend more quality time with your horse, delivering a standout performance, all while blending in. Learn more at ritchiefount.com. So what considerations should managers make for smaller properties where they really can't keep horses off the pastures for extended periods of time? How can they improve the pasture quality?
So, I think this is a hard conversation to have. People want to see their horses out on pasture, but I think you really have to sit down and say, what are your goals? If you are, for example, in the state of Minnesota, and you have 4 acres of pasture, but you have 4 horses, but you want your horses to graze throughout the growing season, the hard conversation to have is that's not reality. So first of all, you have to know what your stocking rate, the recommended stocking rate is in your state. You have to look at the amount of pasture you have and the number of horses you have. Most horse owners have more horses and less pasture than what can support their horses. So I think every single property should have a dry lot where the horses are kept when the pasture is resting. When you're fertilizing, the fertilizer has to be soaked into the ground with rainfall. So you want to fertilize before you have a rainfall. If you're using herbicides to control weeds, a lot of herbicides have a grazing restriction listed on the label. You have to have somewhere to put the horses when they're not on the pasture. A dry lot is essential. People need to think about, do we want an exercise area or a pasture? They are very different. An exercise area is something that you are using for turnout. You're using it so the horses can exercise. An exercise area is not meant to provide your horse with nutrition. We want a pasture to provide your horse with nutrition as well as exercise and being social. So I think the biggest thing is you really have to sit down and evaluate your facility. How many acres of pasture? How many horses? Also, what are you willing to do? We talked about the 5 things you have to do for rotational grazing: resting, mowing, dragging, controlling weeds, and fertilizing. Those things have to happen every single year. It's ongoing. The more you do, the more horses your pasture can support. Now, you're not going to be able to go to 40 acres per horse down to 10, but there is some wiggle room in there. The more intensely you manage the pasture, just the more horses you can support. So I think every horse has to have a dry lot. And if you only have a few acres of pasture and a handful of horses, you have to have that conversation with yourself and understand that they're going to have to be on the dry lot during the growing season, the grazing season. You're going to have to supplement hay if you want your pasture to thrive.
I love the distinction between a a turnout space for exercise and grazing pasture. I think a lot of people use the word turnout as any kind of outdoor time, but I really like that you've made a distinction there.
Yes, you really have to because they are very different, right? An exercise area or turnout, you're probably supplementing hay. You don't expect them to graze. It is literally just turnout. A pasture has completely different goals.
So unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time today, but I have one more question for you, and it's something that I ask all of my guests. And this is, what is one common misconception that you often hear about horse pasture maintenance? I know you've touched on a few, and I'm sure there's a lot, but if you had one that you had to talk about, what would it be?
I think horse owners think that pasture management is just too hard. And I would just like to assure everyone you can do it, right? Rome was not built in a day. If you are fortunate enough to have 20 acres of pasture, don't try to renovate the whole 20 acres. Take it in 5-acre chunks. It's expensive. It's an investment of time and resources and money and labor. So remember, it comes down to 5 things. Resting, which we can all get behind. Everybody needs rest, including pasture. Mowing and dragging, weed control, whether that's achieved through mowing or through a herbicide application. If you're using a herbicide, make sure you read the label. The herbicide should be, it has to be labeled for a pasture, and it should have the weeds that you're trying to kill, on that product. And then fertilizing. It's really only 5 things. And one thing is resting, which doesn't require us to do anything but have that, just have that, we have to have the discipline to not open that gate. So it isn't that hard, but it does require time and effort, but the payoff is great. You could have, you feed less hay. There's a major health benefit, both physically and mentally. And plus, I think we all just enjoy seeing our horses on pasture if we are fortunate enough to have it.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think the health benefits for the horse and the financial savings is a huge motivator for taking care of your pastures.
Yes, absolutely. And Hailey, I give you credit for doing this podcast because I think horse owners are really interested in learning more about pasture management because they do want the best for their horse. And poor pasture management is usually just people not understanding how plants grow and what plants need. And everybody has the best intentions. And then it comes down to just time and money and resources. But horse owners can do it. They truly can. And it's not overwhelming if you take it in small bites and just think of those 5 things: resting, mowing, dragging, controlling weeds, and fertilizing.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but it's been awesome talking with you today, Dr. Martinson. I think people will find a lot of value in this conversation.
Oh, thank you very much. I was glad to be here.
And thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management podcast to a friend.